We're here.
All right, so welcome everybody to the session on commodity finance. So this is a special workshop, which is the first part of the two series, two workshop series. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrea Roncoroni, who's going to say a few words.
Thank you, Jerome. It's a pleasure for me to stay here with you today. And this workshop is a particular session that has been endorsed by the Energy and Commodity Finance Research Center here at ESSEC. And it's a pleasure for me to have Jérôme Détemple here as a chairman of today's session on commodity finance and tomorrow's session on energy finance. And my first welcome is for Álvaro Cartea from UCL, who is going to introduce us with risk premia in commodity markets. Thank you, Álvaro.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrea and Jerome, and for the invitation. I know I only have 20 minutes, so rather than focusing on some of the details of my talk, I at least want to tell you what the idea behind the paper is. We've been working on it for quite a while. Perfect paper, there's no such thing, but let's see what is it we're trying to get at. So the motivation of the paper is, it's very simple. Right? If you look at commodities as an asset class, we know it's different for many reasons, right? And one way in which you can see that is the behavior of prices actually is very different from what you normally see when you look at equity. But I've been asking myself, over the last 10 years, in fact, when I first started working on mostly electricity pricing in 2005, I think, or 2004, is, see, when you write down a model, you have to make a decision as to you're going to do it under the risk neutral measure or you're going to do it under the statistical measure. And depending on what you want to do, you champion, well, I'm going to write a spot model under the statistical measure because I do want to understand how prices behave, and there's exposures to some sort of risk that I need to understand under the statistical measure. Then I need to do some pricing because I need to cover my position and so on and so on. So that forces you to also think about the risk neutral measure. You might be a guy with a physical exposure. In energy, for example, it's very important producers and buyers do have a say in how prices move, right? And just from that point of view, it's kind of different from what you observe in equity, where there's tons of people and very few have the sort of power to move the market, or are more hard to come by than, let's say, if you're a producer of cocoa or if you're a consumer of electricity or gas, etc. There's some other sort of players who seek a financial exposure. These guys are understanding what happens to a particular statistical measure, pricing measure, and what the paper tries, well, how can you observe prices and write down a model that somehow under the risk neutral measure, and you change the measure, let's say if you want to see it like that, see how risk adjusts the dynamics, how do you reconcile both? Most of the time the problem is if, for example, you observe gas, electricity, or some of the agriculturals, there's some huge spikes that persist for a day or two and then they come down, and it's kind of very to see how can that have any bearing on the pricing of a forward contract, which is kind of the primitive or a building block in most of these commodities because the spot is hardly ever traded. How does that translate into something that under the risk neutral measure you say, well, I kind of believe that? So how are these two related? Is an important question. Sounds kind of trivial, but I don't think the literature has spent enough time trying to see the link between these two and have something which allows the two approaches to coexist. By two approaches, again, I mean if you start from the statistical measure modeling the spot or a proxy to the spot, and how do you end up adjusting this measure or agents in the market to price forwards or any other derivative written on the commodity. Let me give you an example of why I think this is different and kind of interesting. if you think of equity, and you look at that, depending on your background, a random pay of a stochastic discount factor or a kernel, or hedging, or you change measure, depending on your background. But one thing which is normally true is that if I look at equity and write down a model under the fiscal measure, and then do some sort of mathematical change of measure, or look at what the kernel looks like, normally, if you think of a representative agent who's risk averse, you'll end up taking, what ends up happening is if you have, let's say that's the distribution of returns for the stock, and somehow you come that under the fiscal measure, that's the distribution of your returns over a day or over an hour, doesn't matter much the frequency. If you look at prices, let's say options, okay, very liquid options, what you normally observe is that under the Q measure, you have a much heavier tail on the left-hand side, as if agents adjust the measure by shifting mass from good events onto bad events, right? So if you're a buy and hold investor, you would behave as if you observe what happens in real life, or your attitude towards risk. In equilibrium, you end up pricing as if the distribution is, heavier on the left side. And one way to interpret them, I'm very happy to take probability out of the good events and shift them onto the bad events and so on. So you can see empirical studies that pretty much for equity, holds, regardless of what, if you're using a stochastical model, stochastic volatility model, or a jump model, and so on. What can I say about that in commodities? Can I say something as sensible as that? Will agents take probability away or mass away from events that they dislike, that they like, and sort of overemphasize the events they dislike? Would that be the case? Well, that's more or less what the paper will set out to do. And what I'm showing here is a watered down version of the more technical version we used to have, but because you don't have to get too technical to actually illustrate some of these points. So let me tell you a little bit of what the roadmap of what we do, but I'll just focus within the 20 minutes on the sort of nuggets that I think will show you what I find interesting. So as for any commodity, we're going to try and write down a model where you have a seasonal trend, which is very important in commodities, because demand and supply and and costs and so on play a big role in prices. Normally, all models I've seen under the statistical measure, you want to capture short-term spikes. Electricity is a good example, oil is a good example, some agriculture is a good example, gas. You have most spikes survive for a very, very short period of time, a day or 2 days, and so on. So they normally either go up or down, and immediately these die away. And it pretty much is a mismatch of demand and supply over hours in electricity or over days in all the commodities. Also, most models will show a short-term mean reverting noise, because after all, commodities in the long term should converge to the production costs and the equilibrium between demand and supply. And what you have around it over the short term and medium term, are all these shocks that some take you away from where you should be for good reason, and you end up they end up going away or dying out, and you converge to the seesaw trend, right? So we're going to start thinking, okay, that's my fiscal measure, will have those attributes. I'll try and sort of think of a risk-adjusted measure that will give me a little bit of room to maneuver, right? You can immediately sort of do something to your statistical measure and risk adjust it in such a way, in a sort of trivial way, that things would work. Or as you will see when I write down the model, where do we sort of allow more flexibility than usual? Some of this stuff has been used in interest rates. In the empirical part, to illustrate how when I start comparing, I would like to see numbers and see actually what data tell me. I'll focus mostly on gas and electricity, and we use an MMC Markov chain Monte Carlo method to do the estimation. Different versions of the paper have different ways of implementing the model, and this is the more robust one we've had so far, and that's why we stuck to it. Just a couple of key results. So one thing we find, Okay, since I only have 20 minutes, I just want to make sure I convey the final message. Is if I write down a model where I have then some Gaussian OU component, and then some jumps, okay, or big spikes that are very difficult to capture with a Gaussian component, even if you have stochastic Vol, we find that agents risk adjust the statistical measure, and it so happens that jumps completely disappear from the market. I'll say a little bit more about that later on and how it's connected to the literature so far and what do people do ad hocly. And that lends strong support, to all models I've seen in the past for just a forward model. We also find that although jumps tend to disappear in the sense that they mean revert super fast under the risk-adjusted measure compared to the physical measure, there's an element of self-excitation, which in commodities, especially in energy, you normally see, right? Let's say you write down a model where, arrival of, spikes are in a Poisson way, and a homogeneous Poisson process does not really capture what goes on in the market, because if there's a mismatch between demand and supply, normally this thing persists for a little while because, electricity is obvious, sort of a generator breaks down and then you have a shortage of supply. It might last for a few days and you see the jumps, for example. We'll obtain that. And, I'm not talking about a Hawkes process. So you'll see immediately, when I show you the formulas, you'll see what I mean by self-excitation. They become state dependent. Thing we find very interesting that's persistent in all of the estimation we've done, for different versions of the paper, is that the Gaussian process that is pretty much the noise and sort of more sort of civilized deviations from the seasonal trend end up behaving as if they were arithmetic Brownian motions. Okay, so you might start off with a model that you have a lot of mean reversion because that's what the statistical measure shows you. You can even eyeball. If I show you, I have a picture later on. Prices and no deviations end up dying out very quickly. But the Gaussian OU, in fact, that mean reversion becomes so slow under the risk-adjusted measure that is where agents are behaving as if all of these deviations, I'm going to treat them as if they don't die out that quick. The conservative parts of the behavior and supporting my results. I'm saying that this is the definite truth, but the interpretation would be that I know that deviations from the season I don't like, whether I'm a producer or a consumer, or maybe a guy buying instruments written on a commodity. And one way in which I shift in my distribution when I do my pricing by overstating unwanted events is that my unwanted events are deviations from it. Those are the things I might fear the most. Whether I'm short, this is a different, commodities is a different market because producers and consumers, they have kind of, they're looking want to sell, they're both looking to hedge price risk. So, so long as you're close to the seasonal component, you're happy because you can predict and you can sort of act on predictions and sort of work around the seasonal component, but deviations around that seasonal component you might not like as much. Here we end up showing that you end up overstating those deviations by slowing down the mean reversion rate in such a way that it looks as if nothing really mean revert in the risk-adjusted measure. But on the other hand, we said that the jumps pretty much disappear. But it's true, you look at forward contracts in commodities, it's very, you hardly ever see them jump. And of course, forward contracts by definition are, you have a delivery period, you're averaging over a few days. So it's kind of even in a mechanical way, having in forward contracts for commodities, jumps in there is kind of a difficult thing to swallow. And if you see any models that only write down a model for forward contracts, they start from the risk and model. All of them are pretty much Gaussian, right? None of them make an effort to include jumps in there because you don't really observe them in the data. But that would conflict with all jumps, and they don't know what to do with it in the price data generating measure or statistical measure. So let me tell you how we do this. So this is, you can as depending on where you want that. So I'm writing that, you know, I'm just showing you a 3-factor model with exactly these 3 pieces. Okay, so it's a little bit of compact notation. So I'm going to assume, let me start here. I'm going to assume that my spot price, first of all, is arithmetic, which makes things easy. And there's no problem. We all know that commodities, you know, negative price is not impossible. In fact, for some of them, it's a common thing to see, right? Okay. So that's what I've written there. And I'm going to assume that one factor, I think it's, let me see my matrix. Did I write it there? Yes. This factor is OU. So this, you can think of it as Brownian motion. So this is the typical OU process that you observe using commodities, and Andrea will talk about that one in his paper. Then the second factor is pretty much an arithmetic Brownian motion. Let me do 2 here. Okay. What is that factor there? Well, most people understand that assuming that you know with 100% certainty what the seasonal component will be is kind of not right. And one way in which you fix that is to say, well, I know with a little bit of noise what the seasonal component will be later on. Okay, I've been told I have 5 minutes. And the last one is the jump component. So I'll assume something like this. Okay, and, you know, I can have, instead of 1, 2 factors and so on, this is the component that will give me the big spikes up or down in the underlying spot market, right? So in fact, I could have, what I really want here is 2 factors, 1 for jumps up and 1 for jumps down and so on. But again, for simplicity, I'm showing you 3 factors. So how do, you know, I want to allow myself to look at empirical data and match prices to a model that allows that I'm not in a straitjacket that forces me to keep mean reversions rate the same, or mean reversion, you know, long-term levels. All of these are mean reverting to 0, but that's not the case. So the risk-adjusted measure we propose here allows me a little bit of freedom. And in the next slide, it will be clearer. I will allow, okay, so I take all of my processes, I risk adjust them, and the way in which I do it, you know, in interest rate theory, you've seen it a few times, and some commodities might also have for the diffusive component, which is you allow the mean reversion rate to also vary. For the jump component, it's a little bit more complicated, but we also do the same because, you know, in commodities, one of the things you really want to insure yourself against is large deviations away from the seasonal component. So, but in the risk-adjusted measure, it's not clear what the agents are doing, not only because this is really far away out there, but, you know, what are the things that you really value or try and shift around when you do the pricing? So imagine if this is a jump component under the risk-neutral measure or risk-adjusted measure, I'm allowing the mean reversion rate to change. Okay, so this will be the new mean reverting sort of speed under the Q measure, and that's you can interpret it where it's mean reverting to. I would have to sort of factor this out and so on, but that allows me to, if the data support that, will tell me that mean reversion will be quicker or slower depending on what comes out. We'll see that later on. The important thing we see here, and I'm not saying that's a Levy process or this is a kind of a complicated process with a sort of complicated Levy, you know, jump arrival measure and so on. This is not, you know, not trivial. So not only do you change the speed of mean reversion, or you can allow the speed of mean reversion to change, but you also affect the arrival rate of jumps. Let's say I'm thinking about jumps up, you end up, that's under the statistical measure, then if this parameter is non-zero, then you also allow for jumps to arrive differently, right? You can't see here volatility, you know, jump clustering, because if there's a jump, you know, up, then the factor of 3 goes up, therefore the arrival rate is even higher, so you capture that sort of, that's what I call self-excitation. It's not a Hawk's process, but it has that feature that if I jump then I'll see the probability of observing a jump again is much higher than before. So let me go to the findings. So I can write a forward contract in closed form. That was important. That's why we assumed to go the arithmetic model. You can also do it geometric, and most of the results go through. But then the estimation is a little bit more. It is trickier. Okay, so you can write it down in closed form. I'm going to sort of gloss over the MCM, the estimation. So what are we using? So here's the data. So we take a few years. We're updating this to 2014, right? Nearly 10 years of natural gas. We'll have day-ahead prices and month plus 1, 3, 6, and 9. These are the forward contracts. So delivering really far out. So we'll have 10,000 observations. Roughly 9 years. Well, not as many years for electricity, but again, quite the same sort of contract maturity: 1 month out, 3 months, 6 months, and these are all monthly contracts. So you have the whole spectrum of short-term contracts and long-term contracts, because those will have a bearing on what comes out. Okay, so here's the spot, and here's the forwards for gas and electricity. In the interest of time, let me just then show you what are the interesting things that come out, right? So if we do our estimation under the fiscal measure, right? And the good thing about our approach is it allows you confidence intervals, right? So that's one of the things that was important for us. The other methods were more difficult to actually understand your error around your parameter estimates. So we see that under the statistical measure, over 100 days on average, you see 5 jumps for gas, 15 for electricity. That's the mean size of the jump, the standard deviation. I'm assuming that every time the jump arrives, it has a Gaussian distribution, because that helps me in the estimation. These are the mean reversion rates for the OU process here and the jump process. So all of this is under statistical measures. So depending what kind of a player I am, I'm very interested in understanding this, because then I'll turn around and do my hedging and risk control and so on. What is interesting is that when I sort of look at my risk-adjusted measure and look at the parameters that come out, I see that the speed of mean reversion for this component is very, very slow. Okay, so the one I'm pretty much thinking about is the 3-factor one, which is the OU, AB, MRG. I didn't want to bother you with all the details. In the paper we go through different combinations, but look at the full-blown one. So the expected half-life in gas, it's 630 days under the risk-adjusted measure. So any small shock will survive for very, very long, right? So the agent is shifting mass from good events to the events that deviate from mu. And for the other one, for the jump, which we found surprising, is that jumps mean revert so quickly that they pretty much are non-existent under the risk-adjusted measure. And you end up writing a model that looks like the Gaussian forward contract models that you encounter left and right in the literature. So here you find a proof that connects that the two can coexist, and you can write the two, something on the statistical measure that captures the features, and under the risk neutral measure, what people at Hockley have been using for years, because it makes sense. I'll stop there because my chair standing up.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. So the discussion for the paper is Evgenia Pasari.
So, hello everyone, thank you for having me here. So first of all, I would like to start by apologizing being a bit of an outsider in this literature, as I work in the border of economics and finance, exchange rates, and doing empirical work myself. However, I quite enjoyed the paper, so I'll just try to make the most of it, and hopefully suggest something useful to Alvaro. So first of all, I'm going to skip quickly the research question again and the contribution of the paper, since I think Alvaro was very clear detailing both. And so I'm going to quickly jump to the things of the paper that I liked, that I enjoyed. So first of all, it's a very straightforward paper to read. I think it's a very interesting topic. The maths, everything was done in a very elegant and clear way. So in particular, I found it very interesting that the authors propose a parsimonious reduced form model that is able to capture the main characteristics of commodity prices under the data generating measure. And in this way, that they show that there is a family of risk-adjusted measures that allows for mean reversion of jump component of spot prices to differ under the P and the Q measure. Coming to some issues that I might have, partly because of my background. So basically, I would, looking at things from a more macroeconomic perspective, I would have liked to ask if we could really dig one level deeper. In a sense, what can we learn, or can we learn something about the fundamental sources of this type of randomness of the two processes? So whether we're talking about diffusion or jump processes, can we really tell something about what is the driver of this behavior? So also there have been a lot of recent changes due to various different developments. And in particular, we had in the recent years a change in regulation. Also, we have a spike in correlation between stock and commodity prices due to indexing, basically. But also we have a spike in correlation between commodities themselves. So we also saw in the US a fall in the natural gas prices, which is an input, in a sense, for electricity prices, if I'm not wrong. So essentially, we might have new relationships being formed. And given that the paper essentially being a reduced form model, I mean, it is bound to place more important in the history of the prices and returns. I'm just wondering about the forward-looking, if you want, information that we can get. So finally, from an industry or portfolio management perspective, it's also maybe important that the model is able to tell us something about correlations between essentially power prices, other energy prices, and power demand. And a couple of more trivial suggestions, if you want to basically talk to a more general audience that is less into this literature. So I would have maybe like to see, I know now that you have a lot of very technical versions of the paper, and I don't doubt it, but just in this particular version, a bit of more of sensitivity analysis. So it's true that some of the module features are able to capture some very particular and peculiar characteristics of the electricity market. So could the framework be applied to a wider variety of commodities? So maybe I understand that there are models for different types of commodities, but I think it's always a good trade of a model if you can apply to a variety of different asset classes, or within the same asset class, different commodities in that particular case. And for certain aspects, I would have liked to see a bit of more detail. So regarding the convenience yield, how can one infer the stochastic process? So I know it's doable, but I would like to learn some more. So thank you.
Very good, thank you. Alvaro,
well, thank you very much. I think your thoughts on, you sound like a co-author, or like what I would say, my co-author. So, I've just jotted a few of the comments. The convenience yield, I agree, and you can in fact recast some of our, the arithmetic model we have there. You can recast it and think of it as stochastic convenience yield. And we held a paper for 6 months trying to, and you can do it. You need interest rates and so on, and that's why we pulled that bit out. I do think this can be applied to any commodity, not only energy. We chose energy because we have the data and we understand it very well. But most commodities will always have a seasonal trend because of the fundamentals. You're spot on. The mu in there captures the fundamentals of the market, demand and supply. On the long term, that's pretty much what the average price ends up being, and that ties into your forward-looking information question. When you want to do this properly, that mu has to capture anything that the market perceives as might be changes in regulation, and you see it, right? And I remember at some point they changed how some quantity were to be traded, and the whole forward curve, changed. So you can extract a little bit of info from the forward market that would somehow price in mu. Then the estimation is a little bit more difficult. Correlation with oil prices, I completely agree, especially that I'm trying to sell the idea that a financial player should look at this, and we haven't done anything about that. And I do agree that changing the sort of constituent players and the amount of players that can come into the market might tame a lot of what's going on in this market, especially the difference between the forward price and the expected spot. I've always been of the idea that correlation with other asset classes might have a bearing on how big these are, or might also magnify them. It's not clear. But yeah, I'll stop there. But thank you very much. I think that was a very good comment.
Thank you. Maybe very quickly, a question from the audience. If there is any question, any comment?
Can you talk very briefly about how do you model the transition from P and Q? I'm not sure I got it from there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the way we do it, we write down the model on the feed and we end up sort of hardwiring what the change of measurement look like, and then we estimate the parameters. But the way in which we do it allows us a lot of room to maneuver in terms that we can change the intensity of arrival and make it stochastic. It doesn't have to be a levy process under P and a levy process under Q. In fact, we show that it's stochastic risk premium, what we're actually modeling. We allow for mean reversion changes in the speed for both the diffusion, which is an interest rate, something people have done for a while, but not in jumps. But to that extent, we are forcing the model to do something, right? And then the estimation, you take your pick how you want to do it, right? My co-author was adamant that he wanted to do the Monte Carlo market. I said, yeah, well, go ahead and do it, right? And that took, a year of work. But, the estimates are more robust, right? Depending how far you want to take it, then, you might need to resort to all the sort of numerical schemes to estimate parameters.
Very good. So let's move on to the second paper, Commodity Currencies Revisited by Evgenia. Sorry.
It looks very similar to the discussion of the first.
So, hello again. So, this is a version of my job market paper that I'm currently updating. So, I'm going to now revisit the notion of commodity currencies, and I'm going to give a bit of a definition here because I realize that this is an exchange rate paper and the audience is more of a commodities audience. So essentially, commodity currencies are the currencies of the countries that they rely on the export of primary commodities for income. So essentially, explaining exchange rate behavior using economic fundamentals has been a very big puzzle in the international finance literature. So this is where I'm coming from here. And in this particular, if you want, puzzle, commodity currencies offer a rather attractive laboratory. And the reason is twofold. So first of all, although I'm not going to make an exogenity statement here, if you tend to think about the models such as UAP and purchasing power parity, the explanatory variables tend to be either instruments or measures of monetary policy. So in that respect, we sort of improve when we use commodity prices trying to explain exchange rate. The second advantage is the fact that we somehow manage to mitigate temporal aggregation bias. So in a sense, if you think about the purchasing power parity, model. One of the critics is the fact that in the case that arbitrage will occur throughout the period, so there is a misalignment of prices between two countries, and an agent acts to correct this arbitrage. That cannot be easily get captured by the data, because the data can only be sampled on a monthly basis. But we are able to observe commodities on a very high frequency. So essentially, the literature documents a long-run link between these two variables. And there is some mixed evidence, but I'm going to essentially focus on just the question, being an exchange rate person myself, of can we eventually learn anything about exchange rates using commodity price movements? So, as I said, the paper builds on this long debate in international finance, and the novelty here in the commodity currencies literature is that with this paper I'm going to employ a large cross-section of countries. So this has not been the case in the past, the reason being that commodity exporters tend to be emerging markets. So think about Chile, think about Brazil. We have a handful of developed markets such as Canada, New Zealand, Australia, but essentially these would only allow researchers to perform case studies. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to try to expand the channel to also commodity importers, and this way I'm going to end up with a panel of 25 countries. So in particular, I'm going to build a strategy for exchange rate forecasting that conditions on changes in global prices of commodities. So the contribution of this paper essentially is twofold. So first of all, I built to the growing literature in exchange rates that studies the cross-section of currency returns that has been pioneered by Hanno Lustig and Adrian Verdelan. And I'm going to do it by proposing a novel strategy that has some theoretical underpinnings. At the same time, my contribution to the international finance literature is that I managed to establish a link between exchange rates and commodity prices on a daily basis. And I'm going to explore this cross-sectional dimension in an asset pricing framework, expanding my country panel to importers as well. So the channel essentially linking these two fundamental variables is very simple. So essentially, there is a theoretical relationship that stems from the fact that for commodity exporters, fluctuation in commodity prices have been found both empirically and theoretically to explain a non-trivial component of the terms of trade of the country. And the terms of trade, in turn, have been found to be important for the country's exchange rate. So think about Chile. So as an investor, you observe the price of copper going up today. So you interpret this as good news for the Chilean terms of trade. So the exports are going up, so the terms of trade improves. So then you tend to expect that the peso is going to appreciate, as simple as that. So essentially, when I was building these relationships and I was looking at the data and I was looking at terms of trade and commodity prices, I stumbled across these graphs. So you can see in the left panel, we have Canada, Mexico, and on the lower right panel, we have Brazil. And what I'm plotting here is the evolution of commodity prices with the country's terms of trade. So there is an evidence, if you want, for movement of these variables. Now, what was interesting was the case of Japan. So Japan is not obviously a commodity exporter, but is a huge commodity importer, and in this particular case, of crude oil. So when you plot the evolution of Brent crude, which is the blue line with the Japanese terms of trade, you see that these two behave as a mirror image to each other. So coming back to our terms of trade intuition, then again, if a commodity price goes up and you tend to import this commodity, that's bad news for your terms of trade. So we might as well try to anticipate if that has also implications about the exchange rate of the importer. So essentially, my main findings, because I will probably run out of time, is that I find forecasting ability of commodity prices for the exchange rate. And the trading strategy that exploits this relationship is able to lead us to economically significant returns. So these returns tend to peak during the recent financial crisis, unlike the majority of FX strategies that collapsed. Think about the carry trade. And also, it tends to work well across different samples. So finally, this relationship is relevant for a broader set of currencies besides commodity currencies, and in particularly, it works as well for developed markets. So the methodology, I'm going to build a country-specific commodity strategy by taking into account country-specific imports and exports. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to build country individual regressions using the most important exports and imports of the country. So I build individual weights using data from the Trade Statistics database. So essentially, I only include in my regression the commodities that account for a specific portion of the country's GDP. And I make them enter individually in these regressions. So then I perform an in-sample analysis as well as an out-of-sample forecast exercise. And ultimately, I'm going to use this out-of-sample exercise, this forecast, my y-hats, to build a trading strategy. And once I get them, I'm going to allocate my currencies into 5 portfolios, a la Lustig and Verdellen, and devise this long-short strategy that is going to go long the currencies that I forecast out of sample to appreciate, and short the currencies that I forecast out of sample to depreciate. So essentially, as I said, this is a relationship that has been documented in the past. The first people to look at this were researchers in the Central Bank of Canada. And we have the first paper to talk about the terms of trade channel, which is the Chen and Rogoff paper of 2003. So subsequently, however, these authors, along with Barbara Rossi, in their QGE paper of 2010, revisit this statement. So they find that, in particular, it's exchange rates that are able to forecast commodities and not vice versa. And the reasoning for this statement is that exchange rate is a forward-looking variable, while commodities turn to react to supply and demand shocks. So in their analysis, they rely in Reisner causality as well as out-of-sample forecast regressions, and they find the reverse relationship to be stronger. So finally, there is a bunch of papers who look at essentially the cross-section of currency returns. So the papers on the second bullet point I'm going to use for my asset pricing bit. So in the first part of the analysis, after I'm going to present you my baseline regression and talk about the countries and the commodities in stake, I'm just going to try to talk to the literature and bridge the gap between my study and the previous studies. So essentially, I estimate a super simple regression, where on the left-hand side, I have log exchange rate returns, and on the right-hand side, I have commodity price returns. The only trick here, if you want, the only difference is that I allow this component to be country-specific. So essentially, depending on the country, as an explanatory variable, I might have between 1 and 4 commodities. So 2 criteria for this selection. Criteria number 1, these commodities constitute at least 5% or more of the country's GDP. Second criterion, I'm only using tradable indices. So these are all GSCI components. So I have no liquidity issues. So essentially, as a safety check, when I start, I run full sample regressions. And I do this in order to check if my coefficients are correctly signed and what I'm doing is meaningful. So for the exports, what I anticipate and what I indeed find is that my betas are negative. And if you think that I'm using an exchange rate quotation, which is domestic currency over the US dollar, if the price of an export goes up, then the difference in exchange rate should go down. Therefore, the domestic currency should appreciate. So I also ran a couple of placebo tests just to make sure it's not a general commodity effect, but is a commodity specific. So they tend to work well. So essentially, I'm going to quickly go through this part. So I'm just looking at what the literature has been done and what I've been doing. So I replicate essentially the Granger causality test of Jen Rogoff and Rossi, but instead of 3 currencies, you look at the bigger picture of 25 currencies. Just quickly, what I find is that the Granger causality appears to be stronger from commodities to the currencies and not vice versa. And the same picture is true when we look at out-of-sample forecasting ability, where I'm able to beat the random walk for 16 out of 25 countries. Again, the reverse relationship does not seem to work well. So when I look at the forecasting ability for currencies to commodities, looking at this bigger universe of currencies, I'm only able to beat the random walk for 3 out of 25 countries. Now, coming to the cross-section analysis of my currency returns, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use my out-of-sample forecast to devise this strategy. So allocate my currencies every period to a portfolio. So I'm going to end up with 5 portfolios. Portfolio number 1, which is going to be my short portfolio, will contain the currencies that every period are forecasted out of sample to depreciate the most. Portfolio number 5 is going to contain the currencies that are forecasted to appreciate the most. And my dollar neutral long short strategy will go long portfolio number 5 and short portfolio number 1. So I'm going to keep an average portfolio for comparison purposes. And I'm going to perform a similar exercise for the carry trade to illustrate the differences between the 2 strategies. So my data, standard Reuters data for 25 countries and commodities that I showed before in the table. I've already talked about the weighting scheme. So I'm just going to spend a minute on this descriptive statistic table of my 5 portfolios, as long as my long, short, and average portfolio. Now, the upper panel shows spot returns, and the lower panel shows excess returns. And it's important to illustrate the difference here. So spot returns are obvious, but excess returns also include the interest rate differential that you earn by investing in the target currency. So you are expected to earn more in the lower panel, obviously, because you're earning interest on top of that. So the interesting feature here is that although the average portfolio is higher in excess return terms, my corner portfolio, the long minus short portfolio, is more profitable in the spot return. So what I'm seeing here is that the profit from this strategy comes purely from a spot component. So it's really the movement of exchange rate. It's not the interest rate, which is essentially the profit-making mechanism in the carry trade, which I showed just here. So this is the same picture for carry trade returns. And as before, you see a monotonic decrease in the returns, moving from the short to the long portfolio. But this is only valid in the excess return case, because if you see at the reaction of the spot component, this picture just disappears. And the reason is that the carry trade builds on the violation of uncovered interest rate parity. So essentially, the moment you invest in high interest currencies and borrowed in low interest currencies, the spot movements moves adversely to you, but not high enough to erode your profit. So this is a first indication that what is captured, what is being captured here is something very different. So if I now show you the cumulative spot returns of the 2 strategies, so with the blue line, we have the commodity corner portfolio. With the green line, we have the carry trade portfolio. You can see that they are very different. And in particular, during the crisis, they tend to be in a very opposite way. So if we want to see how much we would have actually made by putting our money in the two different strategies from 2002 to the end of 2011, what we can see is that by using the commodity strategy, we would have earned the same cumulative return, following, however, an extremely different path. So, given that the exchange rate market is one of the most liquid markets in the world, this return should not be on the table. So essentially, for the rest of the paper, what I'm trying to do is to understand what is the compensation, so for which risk I'm being compensated for. So I have a part where I'm just trying to identify my risk, the risk factor. So I'm using a standard stochastic discount factor approach. So as a first step, I conduct a principal component analysis. And what I can see is that the first two factors account for actually 87% of the total return variation. So as you can see, the first factor acts here as a level factor, as all portfolios react the same. And the second is the candidate risk factor. So given that I'm running out of time and I should be concluding soon, just to preview my results, I'm not able to identify a risk factor that prices my cross-currency, my cross-section of currency returns. But it seems that transaction costs are able to basically account a lot for these excess returns. If you're more interested into that, there is a way by performing a simple market timing exercise to basically go actually by the transaction cost issue. So I'm not going to repeat my conclusion since I have presumed my results. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Evgenia. So the discussion for the paper is Andrea Van Koren.
Okay, so on a data set of FX rate and commodity price series, I would say a large data set, especially as far as FX is concerned, over a 10-year period, a gradual causality is proved for the relationship moving from commodity prices to FX, and then dismissed in the opposite direction. This result paved the way for testing the ability of a particular kind of trading strategies, namely strategies that are based on signals stemming from commodity prices, and turn them into actions to take in the FX market. 7 instances of particular strategy of this kind have been devised. Actually, there are 5 plus 2 that are combinations of these 5 instances. And then the author has tested them according to a variety of settings. So first, all countries versus developed countries only. Next, they're checked in their pure capital gain over the time period versus capital gain plus transaction costs, so net P&L, I would say. And then continuous rebalancement versus timing rule that would constrain the rebalancing process. So as this is actually the result of the paper in a nutshell. So pure capital gains for the all country-based strategy exhibit a relevant spot as well as excess return statistics. Next, traditional asset pricing analysis reveal no priced risk that is associated to the commodity-based strategy performance. So the author advocates an alternative way to explain this effect. Transaction cost inclusion destroys the strategy profitability. So in this sense, this is perhaps the tightest critics of the study, of at least of the strategy dealt with in this study. However, a constraining action to developed countries partially restores a good performance of the strategy. And what I think is the most interesting point is the last advocated in the paper, namely introducing a timing rule, which basically makes of the strategy a statistical arbitrage one. And in my view, this is actually the second and perhaps more important question I'm going to make to the author, to Eugenia, is that the timing rule seems the most promising direction for establishing the ability to exploit commodity signal-based FX strategies. So there are several examples in existing literature, and they stem more from quantitative trading. So have you made any development in this direction? And in particular, you refer to the uncertainty risk. Risk is already exposure to uncertainty. So what do you mean by uncertainty risk while dealing with timing rules applied to this strategy? And the first question is just a little thing which I personally have not fully understood. When you use the regression moving from commodity to FX, an absolute price is included in the regression equation, whereas in the other way, you consider price differences. So I wonder whether it's correct or is a typo. Is that a typo? Okay. So that's why I think the main question is this one, timing rule. Thanks.
So thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to respond to the comments?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrea, for the comments. So yes, the first, it is indeed a typo. It is a standard appraisal value, so that's a typo. Regarding the timing rule, is something that I'm currently looking at. Depending on the audience that I'm presenting the paper to, I have very sort of different responses. So in a sense, like a finance audience tends to be much more interested and intrigued by that. I have been recently talking to many people from economic departments, and they're really pushing, if you want, an identification in the first step of the problem. So at the same time, I'm just trying to devise a more like a clean identification strategy, because clearly you have omitted variables, you have a lot of heterogeneity going on there. So essentially, this is something that I do ongoing work on together with other things. There are other ways to refine my results a lot. So even the way I'm building the weights can be much more refined. And I'm currently also working in bringing together into a commodity index the imports and the exports. I found out that banks have been using this strategy in linguistic group to trade on that. So any developments, I'm working on it. What I mean, uncertainty risk is probably not the right word, but what I meant to say is that obviously you already engage. I mean, you already have a risk. The moment you do this market timing, to explain what this market timing is. So effectively, you play the strategy, but you only trade when your expected gain is bigger than the ex-ante transaction cost that you see on the market. So you end up trading only 2/3 of the time. So all I'm saying is that you have the risk of the strategy, but you also assume an additional risk in a sense, because you have a rule where you choose arbitrarily when to trade. So you're following the strategy, but you also condition on market timing when this is not well-founded, when you should do. So it's like a more an ad hoc rule.
Okay.
So this is what I meant to say.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
So one of the things I'm asking you is this: if you were to think about the Q measure, it's just giving you the difference between the two rates of interest. Then going to the P, is there some pricing kernel that would help explain exchange rate movements?
That's a good question. I need to think about that.
Any other question or comment? If not, so let's move on to paper number 3 in the session. So the fine structure of commodity arbitrage pricing models by Rashid Brick and Andrea Roncoroni, and Andrea will present.
Okay, here I am again. So this is a nutshell presentation of a quite long study. Long in terms of time, because we have been working for 5 years so far, and long in terms of results, because just the mathematical proofs take about 98 pages. So it was not focusing on a particular paper, but it was really a general study that we wanted to pursue, and then we are thinking about publications later, after we would have obtained something, as we have, apparently. So we focus on arbitrage models for commodity prices. And these kind of models are relative pricing devices that may be classified in terms of their primitives, driving noise terms, as well as the structural element allowing for moving from drive noise into price dynamics. Now, if we examine this literature, which span about, well, if we start with Black 1976, it's a long time ago, but I would say since Gibson Schwartz 1990, there are 25 years of academic and practitioners' research. We basically realized that two main set of primitives are considered. The first set of primitives is what is beloved, I would say, by academics. And that's the spot price convenience yield framework. So here, the main primitive is the spot price dynamics. And the second primitive is a side dividend process. I use the term dividend because this stems from the arbitrage pricing theory jargon. And this is a side cash flow, which incidentally is expressed as a rate, namely as a frequency, something that is quoted per annum. And hence, under continuous compounding, this is referred to as a convenience yield. Needless to say, to have any kind of market model, we need to add cash in both instances. The second approach has been pursued by, well, in 1991 by two papers. One is a paper written by Farshid Jamshidi, a very well-known name from interest rate theory, and Reisman in Israel, who actually proposed basically the same model. Their idea is just to try to understand how they could cope with making the whole forward curve evolve over time, much like the Hijr-Morton framework, for those who are acquainted with that literature. Now, there are other models that have been proposed in the commodity finance literature, which take different kinds of primitives, but all of them can be reconducted to these two frameworks. So the aim of this long study is twofold. First, from the theoretical viewpoint, we wanted to investigate the fundamental structures underlying the interplay between the spot convenience yield model framework and the forward model framework. And from the empirical viewpoint, we wanted to assess both modeling and estimation power of the unveiled connection. So if we want to say what's the end of the story, well, basically we have been able to find out that the structures can be characterized through 5 theorems that unveil the vast majority of models existing. Well, and so far we haven't been able to find any model within that framework that does not fit into these results. And switching between framework, and this is a very interesting thing from the practical viewpoint, has key implications for what people do by modeling. So create and conceive a model, picking some model and possibly adjust it to some particular instances for whatever is the purpose, and also statistically estimate the model. I would say, as a primer snapshot, that we finally managed to get rid of filtering methods, including Kalman filter. And so we are very proud about that. And then we have also managed to obtain some theoretical side results that were, in a sense, pulled by the need of proving the propositions that we have proposed. Indeed, it was actually more difficult to state the theorems than prove them. But while proving them, we realized that not all technical tools were available in the literature. In particular, we have had to prove an extension of the Ito identification formula, which appears to be new. So let me focus on the starting point, these two frameworks. Now, the study is first conducted on what we refer to as standard models. We say standard as, to give a meta definition of standard, it's the simplest non-trivial commodity price model setting for a given primitive collection. So if the primitive collection is the spot convenience yield, that's the pair of equations that we obtain. And if the primitives are the set of forward price, this is actually the main set of equations that we might consider. I say set of equations because the equation on the rightmost side may be either interpreted as a connection of infinitely many, uncountably many equations, one for each maturity, or as a single equation embedded in a Hilbert space. And in that case, it's just one single equation. So as you may notice, I have underlined in blue color a few elements. Why? Well, the reason is that the first result that we have obtained is that if we want to connect these two frameworks, we need to focus on the relationship between the convenience yield drift and the forward volatilities, which a priori is not to be taken for granted. Now, I've written here general regularity conditions, but in the study, every condition is written the right way. So the question is, what is it for? I remember Eugenia questions made earlier to Alvaro and saying, well, what do we learn about that? Well, what can we learn about interchanging those two frameworks? Well, it's worth noticing that if we go over the whole literature of both frameworks, we see that each has their own qualities, their own ability to explain something. Now, let me make a list of all of these features. As far as the spot convenience yield, the framework is concerned, first of all, they're natively Markovian models, and therefore they're used for making the calculations. They lead to analytically tractable formula, and they're very easy to implement. But next, and this is perhaps the reason why academics like this kind of framework, they allow for interpreting the quantities in terms of economic theory, in particular the theory of storage. So some models allow to explain the interplay between mean reversion and inventory levels. Others, like a recent paper by Alvaro, the interplay between the demand volatility and the forward premium. So I would say that from the economic viewpoint, being able to cast models in this framework allows researchers to embed economically significant probabilities. Also, it's quite easy, if not immediate, to input the appropriate pattern of either trend of volatility, which is a key feature of a vast variety of commodities. Let me take the case of agricultural seasonalities or intraday recurrence patterns of electricity price dynamics with hourly granularity, for instance. And finally, this is the most developed framework in the literature. As far as the other framework is concerned, well, the first feature is the reason why practitioners like it. it's based on observable. So it's easy to use it, to implement it. We don't need a filtering technique like the Kalman filter technique, which boils down to linearize some model and perhaps losing the key point of a nonlinear model. They also allow for focusing on the forward volatilities through non-parametric analysis, like principal component analysis, as well as the kind of evolution of this forward volatility, which is present in several markets, like, for instance, the gas market. A typical property which is well known in interest rate theory is the ability to embed an initially quoted forward curve, and therefore that's why this is gathering the most of models employed as a market standard. Now, this slide basically summarizes 3 out of 5 theorems, namely those referring to the deterministic volatility structure. On the leftmost side, you can see the structure of the convenience yield drift. On the right-hand side, you see the structure of the volatility, of the forward volatilities. Now, it's going to take a while to explain this result and to understand how they have been conceived and then proved. So first of all, let me start with the first line. The vast majority of models display convenience yield drift that is linear in the convenience yield. So this linear relationship may be time varying as well. And this entails a corresponding model within the forward curve framework exhibiting forward volatilities that lie in the linear span, possibly time varying linear span, of 2 basis functions. Now, these basis functions are quite particular. The first basis function is the exponential of an integral of a path-dependent functional of alpha, where alpha is the first coefficient. And the second one is the integral of the exponential of the integral of alpha. What can you get from this observation is the fact that the set of forms available for modeling forward volatilities is quite restricted. Because basically you are in the linear span of 2 objects that are constrained by deterministically depending on the same quantity, alpha. So in trying to understand how to extend this to something that is more flexible, namely a linear combination of 2 functions of the same kind with a coefficient k and a coefficient alpha totally disconnected, we have been able to find out that the corresponding spot convenience yield model is linear in the pair spot convenience yield and an ancillary process phi, of which we have the E2 diffusion equation. Interestingly, we have found no published model within this framework. So the major justification of this framework is basically to weaken the tight relationship shown in the first one. And perhaps this is the reason why models in the first line do not perform so well on real-world data. A few models, a quite restricted bunch of models, but still published ones, display a convenience yield drift that is linear in the convenience yield as well as in the logarithmic spot price. In this case, for general time-dependent parameter, there is no explicit expression for the forward volatilities. However, we know that forward volatilities fulfill a second-order ordinary differential equation in the time-to-maturity variable. And for the case of constant coefficients, depending on the sign of the discriminant of the algebraic equation linked to that ordinary differential equation, we have been able to find an exact expression for both volatilities. So if the discriminant is positive, then we have a solution. If the discriminant is 0, we have another solution, and so on. For reason of short availability of time, I will not mention the two additional theorems, but these theorems cover the most of stochastic volatility models appearing in literature. So this is just a quick list ordered in chronological versus starting from like 1976 up to the last paper by Casassus, Leon, Tang on Review of Financial Studies, modeling multi-commodity dynamics. So for each model, we have identified the year of publication, the authors, the standard framework. When you see other, you mean that the set of primitives is other than either spot, convenience yield, or forward, but they can be recasted in both. And the market where the model has been applied, the main features of that model, and the theorem that applies to the model. So you see, all these models belong to the cases treated in, which is the first line, 2, which is the second line. None of them falls into this class, and sometimes a theorem 4. And theorem 4 is the first of the two theorems dealing with stochastic volatility. Let me conclude with an application. As an application, I'm going to do the following. I pick the most known, which is actually the first ever spot convenience yield model, the Gibson-Schwarz model, and then I recast it in the forward framework. Once it's been recasted in the forward framework, I try to exploit the ability of that framework to fit forward volatility curves, and then I see what happens. Well, those two are the forward volatility functions stemming from a spot convenience yield, the Gibson-Schwarz model. And on this data set, which is a kind of periodical data set, I think is, which market is that one?
Yeah.
Is the, which market is gas market or
electricity?
Electricity. So this is an application of electricity market. Actually, we have done about 10 alternative markets. So on the electricity market, we see that this curve is not capable to reproduce this mixed backward dating behavior and seasonal pattern. So some people might conclude that Gibson-Schwarz model is not a good model. I don't agree with this viewpoint. Why? Because we can extend this model the following way. We know that we need to be able to reproduce this function, right? So one possibility is to add a mixed time and cross-sectional, so time means time t, small t, and cross-sectional means maturity, time capital T, seasonal components. Once we finish two components, which are added to the Gibson-Schwarz expression, then we see a fitting. Of course, we can, in a non-parametric way, and then we're going to have a perfect fitting, or using polynomial and seasonal functions and so on. But this is just an exercise, an example. Now, once we have done this, if we still want to use the Gibson-Schwarz model in the original spot convenience yield framework, we can use again theorem 1 to come back. And this is basically what we obtain. This is the starting point of the Gibson-Schwarz. And this is basically what we obtain by coming back using the modified Gibson-Schwarz model. Why this is interesting? Because it basically tells you to which extent the economic consequences and assumptions underpinning the Gibson-Schwarz model are still significant on a model extension that fits market observation. So this is an example of application. In the study, we have done several applications to a wide variety of models, all those that you have seen in the previous slides. And we have applied also to statistical estimation. So as a conclusion, in my last minute, we unveiled the fundamental structure underlying arbitrage models for commodity prices. This result allows us to unify spot convenience yield and forward curve modeling frameworks. The analysis encompasses the standard setting and extends as well to stochastic volatility, cover the majority of published models. And the sample application to model extension has been here illustrated. Additional applications range from model conception, so the way you create a model to fit some features, through model estimation. If we have a model with an observable quantity, we don't need to use the common filter, we just move it to the forward framework, fit it using PCA and other methods, and then come back. And market analysis. Market analysis means saying something about the market by using the appropriate model framework. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas. So the discussant is Alvaro Cartel.
Okay, so I know I have 5 minutes, so I'll just focus on a couple of things rather than praising the paper. But you know, given my previous talk, I think I have a lot of respect for Andreas' attempt of unifying again spot models and arbitrage models. I think it's quite an endeavor, and I like it a lot. I have to admit I didn't read the 90 pages. I read the short version of the paper, which is quite rich in proofs and so on. So I do think it's the time in the literature for us to go through the list of what people have proposed and, you know, put them to the test as to what's going on. And I think there's an important exercise because you know, people haven't done it, and it's important to see if there's any insights or extra information, or whether we've been sort of doing exactly the same as other people without knowing it. So they go through a massive list of models out there in the literature, and they seem to nail each one of them. So I also understand why they've taken so long to work on the paper. So I have a couple of comments coming up, but you know, two questions, since I didn't quite see all of the proofs. Did you, one, investigate, I know you're co-author, so it also goes to you, did you also check the sort of risk neutral, you know, the connection between the change of measure or not? Have you actually proven that you can get, because the way it reads, or when I read it, it reads as if I can match these two, but is that, can you find an allowable change of measure that would in fact, you know, connect the two in a sort of financial way as well, rather than a mathematical way? You put a lot of emphasis on the convenience yield approach, but if I take Gibson-Schwarz, and again I do Gibson-Schwarz with a model that does this, PW1, and the other factor, the usual stuff, well, with different notation. I'm not saying that this is what I have done, but I'll tell you in a minute what I mean. If I take Schwarz and Myth in management science and whatever, you know, a long time ago as well, you can recast this into the Gibson convenience yield with one fewer parameter. So I was wondering if you had any comments as to whether that's a cleaner route to make the connection, given the fact that that nests in a mathematically cleaner way, one fewer parameter, the convenience yield, a lot of the convenience yields are over. You know, why haven't you taken this approach? And then the other two that I wrote when I read the paper, okay, I think, how about calibration? Have you looked at data, or I know it's beyond the scope of it. Is there, you know, whether these connections, can you see them separately in the data? Because it'd be interesting, because you have spot and forwards, and then you find all of these sort of nice mathematical connections. Can you use data to show how those behave? And what are you going to do with the paper right there? It's
yes.
I want to see the published version, not the private one you always send me, right? But 40 pages in there, please.
Yes, yes. So, yes, last question, the publication. Well, I don't know. It depends on the review. And Either we split into two papers, one for deterministic volatility and the other for stochastic volatility, or we just merge into a big paper. That's it. So as for the rest, risk neutral probability. This is important. I haven't mentioned, but we are not concerned with moving from historical to risk neutral probability. Everything has been casted under a risk neutral probability. So we assume there is a complete arbitrage-free market, and we want to move inside. Needless to say, it would be very interesting, for instance, to establish what this link entails in the historical probability, and depending on the market price of risk. So once you have this movement, and you have this movement, it looks like an algebraic graph. But suppose you are in SC under, let's say, a P star, and that's under P, and you have some relationship with F, and then you just put your Radan-Nikodym derivative here, and so you're going to have your SC here. Well, it could be interesting to understand what are the features of this element. In principle, it doesn't change, it should not change in terms of movement, because the change of probability is always the same. But can we move from here to here immediately without taking the whole path? So that could be a question to solve, of course. The other question that you made is on this Schwartz-Smith. Yeah. Well, basically, in the examples, we have considered Schwartz-Smith as well as Cartier-Villaplana, which, as you know, has been developed with different primitives and spot convenience yield, and we have found the spot convenience yield and the forward version of your model as well. So the idea is that if there is a model with some primitives, then it should boil down to a spot price convenience yield or a forward model. Otherwise, the model is in a sense useless. And maybe this relationship is not one-to-one, but what is important is that from these primitives you can move to the other ones. The last question is about the applications, right? So first we made applications to that variety of models you have seen. Next we made applications to model construction and model tuning. The model tuning is the example I've made. And then there is a third branch of applications, which I haven't discussed yet, which is exactly statistical estimation. So, for example, you can pick a Gibson-Schwartz model, you can estimate it the original way using the Kalman filter, but then you come back to the model, you transform it into a forward model, you estimate it using a mix of principal component analysis to identify the number of driving factors, and to understand that at least for that market that's correct, and to fit the parameters of the function, and then come back. And what you get is that you obtain different results, which basically means what? Well, since the relationship between spot and forward is exact from the mathematical viewpoint, and the estimation is also exact in the sense that you don't discretize anything, in particular in the forward framework, then, as a conclusion, on market data, due to the nonlinearities that you have shown in your presentation as well, but using the Kalman filter has to be the last resort, I would say, and not the preferred method. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Alvaro's point regarding Schwartz-Smith. Both of the Schwartz-Smith and Gibson-Schwartz are both two-factor models. Is there an advantage to using one or the other?
Yes, it strongly depends on what you do with the model. I mean, the selection of primitives depends on the ability to exploit the properties. So, as I pointed out in the presentation, exactly at this point, each framework has its own qualities. So I may add a third row by saying, as primitive, I take long-term and short-term levels of price dynamics. Of course, I would have perhaps only 2-3 papers on that. That's why I didn't do the third. And then I would make the list of the qualities. So switching between models allow you to do this, and this is perhaps the most important result to focus on. You don't have to choose the framework depending on what you want to do. You can select one and then move to the other and exploit the fact that you are in the other in order to use those properties and those qualities, and then come back, which is actually what we have done in the application I have seen. So unifying theory is not just a theoretical exercise for the sake of itself, which has been a long time consuming and interesting from the intellectual viewpoint, but is also useful for practical purposes. So you can make those theories boil down to devices that tell you something about reality depending on what the framework is.
Any other questions?
Okay.
All right. If not, let's conclude the session here. So I would like to thank all the presenters, discussants, as well as the audience for a very interesting session. Thank you.
And for those who are attending this workshop in our webinar service, basically, see you tomorrow at the energy session. Thanks.